Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum, and a very good morning to all of you. This is a special morning, I would say, the Malaysian Economic Summit 2021. And first of all, let me say to KSI Strategic Institute for Asia Pacific, jointly getting this done with the Economic Club of Kuala Lumpur and YB Senator Lim Ban Hong, who represented the MITI Minister this morning, and Tan Sri Abdul Wahid Omar, and Tan Sri Michael Yeo. Zain, thank you very much for that introduction. You have saved me a couple of minutes by introducing the panel of speakers. So I will use that for the benefit of the panelists to present their views. This morning, Tan Sri Abdul Wahid Omar and Senator Lim Ban Hong gave us a sort of a perspective and a very positive prognosis. I think in terms of medical word is what you look at the future of Malaysia on the basis of existing circumstances and so on. Last year in October, we had the Economic Summit, same organizers, and we were just looking at 2020 for a while and see how best we can see 2021. And we had a lot of hope at that particular time about what would be the scenario. And I don't think any one of us who were attending or others who were doing the research and other policy initiatives would have envisaged that 2021 would turn out to be something like what we are facing in the first half of 2021. So the pandemic crisis and its manifestation, I don't want to touch on this subject. For nearly 1.5 years, we are braving through this, and I must say there is a certain degree of resilience in Malaysia, both health and economic and social, and then we are putting our best foot forward in circumstances. But the question that is before us and before the panelists, the eminent panelists who are going to speak to you in a short while, is the end in sight? There is a big question mark whether the end in sight, and therefore the word post-COVID is actually relevant. Are we talking about the eradication of the COVID, the impact of the COVID, and then we will go into a sort of a time frame where there is no COVID? I think common sense tells us that it is not going to be that. There is no such thing as a post-COVID, as we can see in certain countries, Singapore, and this morning, Tan Sri Abdul Wahid Omar mentioned about UK. You have to live with it as an endemic or whatever the other phrase that might come in. And here we have science, virology, immunology, epidemiology, medical science, public health, disease control. All these experts and expertise are being put forward together, and the challenges are so great that we are not able to see the end of this prolonged kind of situation. So global efforts, whatever that is happening, and in Malaysia, the question that is asked, is Malaysia different? It is going to be different from any other country. I leave it to the panelists to answer this question, whether it is going to be exceptional. And therefore, we are now looking at, will productivity and growth return in the case of Malaysia? And we are talking about the competitiveness of the Malaysian economy in the new normal. As I said, there is no such thing as a new normal. I think this is a continuing phase of the COVID impact and what we are going to look at. And our slogan, Lindung Diri, Lindung Semua, has to be expanded. I think no country is safe until all countries are safe. I think that is the global phenomenon right in front of us. So with that little overview of what I consider as an important introduction, I think I would like to go to the discussion among the panelists. And we are slightly changing the order in which the panelists were arranged by KSI, by first taking on Professor Tan Sri Dato Sri Noor Azlan Ghazali. He is the Executive Secretary of the National Economic Action Council, and I believe that he might be able to give us what is really happening in terms of the impact and what policy measures and what actually the implementation program that is going to take place. And this will be followed by Tan Sri Yong, who will look at it from an industrial point of view, industry point of view. So one, we have a sort of a government, and then industry, expertise and experience. And then we will move on in the order as it is prescribed to Dr. Jomo, who is well known to you, his expertise now in Khazanah Research Institute and former FEA professor, Under Secretary of UN, and now also back into some form of academic. So you will see an academic perspective. And this will be supported later by Dr. Evelyn S. Devadason, professor at FEA, University of Malaya. And finally, we will move on to Khoo, Mr. Andrew Khoo, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Malayan United Industries. Again, we will sum it up with an industry and business perspective. So having said this, I welcome all the panelists, and it is over to you. So Professor Tan Sri Dato Sri Noor Azlan Ghazali, you are now taking the floor. Have we got the connections?
Yeah. Thank you, Dato Sri.
Yes.
And very good morning, Tan Sri Abdul Wahid and distinguished panel, as well as audience out there. I hope everybody is in a good situation, safe and sound. Okay, actually, I did volunteer myself to be first because the rest of the speakers probably, I'm probably the one in Putrajaya that probably can share some insight and some of the concern. But I must admit, please allow me to also, be a bit more independent in terms of giving my views. Do not take this as a pure, coming from EAC. It's a very challenging episode for all of us. I like to start by saying that the crisis that we are facing, repeatedly being said, unprecedented, pretty much never ever that a government has to kind of instruct the whole nation to stop doing what they are doing and pretty much, staying at home. This is seriously not normal for a government to instruct the entire citizens to do so. Now, I think the subject that we are looking at is in terms of to regain back growth and also to basically push up productivity. I must say that just very quickly in the platform where I am in the Economic Action Council that's chaired by the Prime Minister, basically, definitely we are all pretty much composed of economies and people from the industries. Representatives from various sectors are there as well. So when you pull everybody together along the same mindset of economics and business, the answer is surely yes. We got to make sure that whatever that we do have to be balanced. We make sure that the consequences on the economy will not be terribly bad. But again, I must say that structurally, then a lot of discussion goes to the National Security Council. Where the balance is being made, hopefully. Looking into, how do we make sure that minimizing the impact on the economy will not be at the compromise of allowing the pandemic, basically COVID-19, to be worse. So that is where the challenge is. And I must say that, after listening to various expertise coming from various areas, I can say it's a very challenging exercise on that part. But the idea of minimizing, trying to make sure that the economy will not be stalled is a serious issues and subject that we are looking at. Now, there are dimensions of things which is shorter term. I would consider this as the injury that the outcomes of all these lockdown and so on. But simultaneously, we have to recognize that part of the severity that we are facing is not actually due to COVID. I mean, it is already there even before COVID. And so if we are talking about productivity and growth, I believe that even years before COVID landed in Malaysia, it is already a subject to many of us. Our inability to push for growth, inability to push for strong transformation toward more high-end, more high-skilled job and so on. And not only that, along the line, I mean, the qualitative dimensions of our growth also become an issue, to the point that is the growth that we are achieving benefiting as many people out there? We have serious gaps. I think Prof. Jomo always raised this issue. I mean gaps in terms of who benefits from the growth. I think the way we design growth is very important to make sure that the benefit of growth spread out, going into various categories of income, as well as in terms of the region. Now, let me point toward productivity. Again, I mean, on the 30th of June, I attended a session where MPC released their productivity reports. Again, if you look at what is actually the main content of the reports, I mean, basically there are 5 trusts. And again, I will say that none of these trusts are new. They were talking about talents. They were talking about technology, the ability of Malaysia to embrace all this. I mean, they're talking about business environment. That again, a subject that was become a focus way back in 2006, 2007 in the era of Pemuda. Everybody is looking at all those ease of doing business, world competitiveness ranking, and so on. While it does not give everything, it does not give all the answers that we want, but I must say that at certain point, I feel like maybe out of COVID or maybe not, that our attention toward creating a quality growth. I mean, when I say quality growth, there are 2 dimensions of it. One is about in terms of the complexity, the sophistication of economy, where we have problems. And the other one is, I mentioned about the quality in terms of assuring as many people are benefiting from this growth. So I think it seems like faded. I mean, not that many people talk about even in terms of the competitiveness of nations. I think there are some serious concerns. If you look at the report, I mean, those who are following, I just give you one or two. I mean, like for example, starting a business, getting credits, paying taxes, all has been dropped very significantly. Very significantly. I think sometimes all this dwindling down is not being popularized. No one talk about it. That's my concern. Productivity wise is simple to me. I mean, as simple as you are given input, how much can you produce out of it? Well, this is about the efficiency of the economy. I think sometimes we tend to measure that too broadly in a very macro sense. I think we need to look into what is inside the box. If we talk about talents, we really have to address this issue. This is, to me, one of the time bomb for Malaysia if we have failed to continue the growth and productivity is the kind of talents that we have in the country. The one that we produce, the one that we attract, and the one that we retain. Sometimes I call this PAR, P-A-R, produce, attract, and retain. Do we produce the right talents? I think this is a serious question. I mean, I was a vice chancellor before. I keep on asking and pushing for this. We all know, I mean, the quality of talents that we need is very different. Post-COVID especially, though hard to say when is actually the post-COVID will start, but whatever it is, the COVID is actually really telling us that, you know, the talents issues that we are facing is serious. You know, our ability to digitize our economy, to embed technology and automations, and also the influx of foreign workforce. Not only that, it causes, I mean, declining in productivity, but also in terms of how, you know, for example, the way we treat foreign workforce in Malaysia now become a pain for us in attending COVID. So that's in terms of talents and capabilities. I think we yet to see a strong results. I mean, I would seriously urge for Malaysia to look at the entirety of our education system, from preschool, I mean, sekolah rendah, I mean, high school, as well as the universities. I mean, true enough, a lot of eyes are looking at the universities, but I want everybody to understand that education is like 4 times 1. I mean, for the rally for, you know, 100 meters, I mean, you have 4 runners there. The preschoolers, the primary school, the high school, and the universities. And you can add on the 5th one, the lifelong learning. Do we have that? I mean, all these are extremely important. And maybe one final note is, again, this idea of the environment. Is Malaysia putting in the environment that would churn desire and excitement and incentive to be better and better? You know, I mean, Malaysia is a place for talented people, for technology to be churned. I mean, those are very serious issues. There are a lot of dimensions of in our economy that probably need to be looked at. For example, that I know across the nation, sometimes I'm worried that the only goal is to make it cheap. The only goal is to make it free. The only goal is to make sure that, you know, out of thinking all these dimensions, sometimes we didn't realize that pushing for cheaper, lower prices, if we don't do it right, it can create some other pain as well. So I think, let me end there. COVID wake us up. Not all problems are because of COVID, but COVID tells that there's lack in terms of us responding to all these long problems that we already face. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tan Sri Noor Azlan. Thank you for sharing as your views from, although you have stated that this is your personal views, but the insights that are provided is actually from a government perspective. It is very comforting to know that the government is not acting in silo. It is actually preparing its policies and implementation programs in consultations with business, because the Economic Action Council itself is composed of many of business and economic sector people. But when the COVID struck, I think the importance is that the impact, and somehow it has not been felt because some chambers, the German chamber, and you'll find that the JETRO, the Japanese side, the EU, and the American chamber, and many of these foreign nations who are investing in Malaysia are looking at this as a problem because there's not been attended to. And I hope, Tan Sri, you will take note of this in your subsequent actions. Pre-COVID problems compounded by COVID situation. I think that's the essence of, and more problems are cropping up, and therefore our recovery and our competitiveness and also.
Dato Sri, can I make just a quick 30 seconds intervention?
You are most welcome. You are most welcome.
I mean, for your information, I mean, I know that while there are news out there being cited about the dissatisfaction of MNCs. But I just want to assure everyone who listens to this, we, myself especially, and the rest, we are very, very close working with MCHAM, Eurocham, Jack Team, and so on. They are in direct communication with me, and the chambers has appeared in EAC, a special paper to bring in the issues. And I believe that some of these has been attended, while not all, but rest assured that especially at the Secretariat, we are very, very close with all the sectors out there. But if there are any other groups who would like to be in communication, feel free to reach me as well. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the intervention. That's good. So we move on from that, from Tan Sri Noor Azlan to Tan Sri Yong Hong Kong. So you are taking the floor, Tan Sri.
Thank you. You can hear me?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mr. Moderator. As you know, what a difference a couple of months make. In April, when we were told about this seminar, it was going to be a physical seminar, and it's going to be spurring productivity and growth after COVID. And now it is a virtual seminar, and since end of May, we are now what we call MCO 3.0. And I think what you alluded to earlier is right, is the end in sight. So before we actually go to post-COVID, I think the whole nation at the moment is still in the containment phase, and it will take some time before this light at the end of the tunnel do come about. And I think we ought to spend some time as to what are the problems here. You just cited a problem about the foreign chambers and meeting and not meeting. We can just recall, I mean, Selangor was just declared all red. Almost all districts were all red. And many of the factories and the businesses were literally caught by surprise by the 1 or 2 days sudden shutdown like this. And I think as we go on in the next few weeks or months, before we know what is happening, we must begin to separate, do not have this binary about lives and livelihoods. They are both one and the same, because the moment when you split it to lives or livelihood, everybody will say, go for lives, and then close the factories, close everything. And then a few weeks, a few months later, a bigger repercussions will come. So I think we need to have that new narrative, and also what is essential and what is non-essential. In this country, there's so many supply chains, Of course, the obvious things is, things like food, electronics is essential. But even food in the first MCO, plastic packaging was not essential until later, and you cannot have food without packaging. The supermarkets cannot sell it. But at the latest one, this latest lockdown, food, you need tin cans to package tin food. But the tin cans may or may not operate. But all I know is the smelters in Penang, they smelt tin ore into tin. They are not allowed to operate. So because of this, in a matter of weeks, you won't have tin, you won't have tin plate, you won't have tin cans, and then you won't have tin food. So I think it is important to move away from essential or non-essential and just go down to everybody, either you cut down 50 or 60%, have plenty scope to distance yourself, good SOP, and everybody run. And I think this is the important thing to go the next few weeks. And even though if there is lockdown, the pain of the lockdown should be shared. You cannot be borne by the employers or businesses. At the moment, the wage subsidy for the last 15 months or so is about 15 billion ringgit. But the total private sector payroll of these 7 or 8 million EPF contributors comes to about 330 billion a year. And if the government subsidizes 15 billion out of 330 billion, it's only 5%. And 95% is borne by the private sector. No doubt a percentage are still operating. So it will not be 95%, but still about 70, 75%. And this is a tremendous burden that is hollowing out the private sector, and it's not obvious until things get much worse in the next few weeks. I think this has to be addressed, and either you go to a more aggressive wage subsidy, like other countries, 50%, 70%, or even 30%, but certainly not that 5 or 6%. And I think as you move towards then you are able to go to be targeted. Of course, you can still have savings. GLCs or GLICs don't need wage subsidy because it's actually funded by the government, most of it anyway. But I also agree that in terms of the growth in the future, things like tourism will not happen, and they are 15% of our GDP. We must find out what we can do to have more travel bubbles. We also know that like Phuket, they are opening up to 26 countries certified green for them to come. And these are the measures that I think we have to progressively or proactively begin to do. And in terms of, someone mentioned about trade liberalization, I think this is also important. We must begin to quickly find steps to rectify the RCEP and the CPTPP. 46 chambers met about a month ago under the ASEAN back, and all of them strongly said, look, these agreements have been negotiated very carefully. Malaysia has signed them together with our partners. It is a question of a domestic legal, shall we say, institutions to change the necessary acts. Many of the concerns like ISDS and pharmaceuticals all have been addressed. It's a question now of quickly ratifying. Vietnam has done it for more than 3 years. They are way ahead. And once you are in those, shall we say, free trade agreements, you become a very attractive destination for reinvestment from the trans-Pacific countries into Malaysia as a springboard to RCEP. I mean, this is a tremendous linchpin effect that could really trigger a trade and investment in a country, especially as we begin to move out from pandemic. And even if a domestic economy takes a long time to recover because of the current high cases, the other countries, due to vaccination, they are all progressing very well. That's why our export markets are improving very well. And it's such a pity that our exporters are not allowed to export. For example, the furniture industry in Johor is about a 8-10 billion industry. They are considered non-essential and they're forced to close. And they've got orders all piling up and we cannot take advantage of it. And in a matter of weeks, they again will be hollowed out. So this very quick ratification of our trade treaties and this across the board, opening up to 60% say capacity. And a 60% capacity per shift, you can, the private sector, once you say you can have more than 60% at one time, they will have what we call alternate weekends. They will overlap their workforce so that some will work Saturday, Sunday off, but some will take Tuesday, Wednesday off. So you begin to say, have better social distancing, but with the same capacity. I mean, there's more time to talk about it later, we can exchange, but I'd like to also touch on Prof. Azlan's point about the importance of our human resource in the real post-COVID recovery, whereby we really need to address our primary school, our secondary school curriculum for us to generate the type of students which are suitable to go into university and therefore take us into this industrial 4.0 and other digitalized economy in the future. I'll stop here at the moment. Thank you, Dato Sri.
Thank you, Tan Sri. Thank you for your, as expected, I think the industries and business perspective is not in sync with the views of the government, although government is trying its best to help industries. But the fact remains on the ground that there are many issues, particularly in the management of the COVID, and also in the MCO introduction. And in this regard, I think a lot of business looking at the MCO 1 and the MCO 3.0, they see that the ability to handle the situation much better earlier, and then somewhat it is a floppy kind of a situation when it comes to the recent introduction and how we are going to help ourselves into the future. I think the important point is that this is not a health issue only, and the health issue impacting the economy, and you have to look at the lives and the livelihood together as one, and you have to balance this risk and see how best you would be able to do the recovery phase. I think this is the important. In the national recovery, what are the recovery programs that we would like to look at? I think very interesting point that Tan Sri Yong brought it up on the RCEP as well as the CCTPP. These are opportunities for business and economy and for the country as a whole to take stock of this very important trade group. And we are not ready yet because of government obstacles and other things. Even during the COVID, I think if you are not doing anything, post-COVID, it is going to be more difficult, and therefore we will have to address some of these points. And productivity is related to this notion of work from home. I hope some of you will be able to address this. This work from home actually has brought down the productivity level to a much lower productive level, to much lower point. With that, from Tan Sri Yong, the industry perspective, we move on to Dr. Jomo. As I said, he has worn many hats, and he is now still a very, very ardent spokesperson, particularly to issues that were brought together by Tan Sri Noor Azlan on some aspects of sustainability and inclusive in the development process. I'm sure he has many views on this issue. Dato, Dr. Jomo.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sri, for this invitation, and to KSI as well. I think it's very important for us to be open to rethinking our views about many things, especially in these very challenging times. I think it is important for us to recognize that we are very much prisoners of our own thinking, our own imagination. And this has become a very serious problem, I feel, during this pandemic especially. We saw this about a quarter of a century ago during the Asian crisis. When the Asian financial crisis happened, it was blamed on Asia, on Asian, so-called Asian values and so on and so forth. People like Alan Greenspan, Michel Camdessu, Larry Summers, all said that it was due to the Asian way of doing things, and that the Asian financial crisis was because of that. Nonetheless, over about a decade later, with the global financial crisis, we find that they adopted many of the policies which were pursued by East Asia in response to the so-called Asian financial crisis. Now we have a very different situation. I say this because I think we always run the danger of fighting the last war. Every war, every situation we have has to be evaluated in terms of its own situation, its own characteristics. And right now we have a situation where the slowdown is not something which has been forced by the contagion of the COVID-19, but rather it has been due to our policy responses in response to the pandemic. This is very important for us to remember, because there are always options, different ways of handling things. And this became if we look at COVID-19, it was first publicly and internationally recognized at the beginning of last year, in January last year. But at that time, it was largely seen as a problem in China and to some extent in Korea. China did make mistakes, I'm sure, but eventually they realized the need for a stay-in-shelter lockdown in Wuhan city and in the 3 surrounding provinces, because the workers in Wuhan city, which is the industrial hub of China for a long time, basically commuted from those other places, and they were spreading the virus. So this became necessary. But elsewhere in East Asia, if we look at Japan, if we look at Korea, we look at Taiwan province of China, the rest of China, we look at Vietnam, we look at Laos, there was never, ever a stay-in-shelter lockdown at the national level. The stay-in-shelter lockdowns are very, very blunt instruments. And this is why I think we shouldn't get into this debate about lives versus livelihoods and so on and so forth. We have to recognize that what the motivation for stay-in-shelter lockdowns is. And the motivation, if you remember, was because this was adopted not in the East, but in the West. If you think about what happened in Britain, for example, because we look to Britain so much in terms of policy, it was only after the ICL study, the Imperial College of London study on 17th of March last year, that they abandoned the previous policy of going for herd immunity. When the ICL study pointed out that there will be so many people who would die from the approach of trying to go for herd immunity and basically not doing anything about it. That was when Britain changed its position, and much of the Anglophone world adopted this. But I think it's very important for us to recognize that that is not the only option. Stay-in-shelter lockdowns are not the only option. And if you look at Korea, you look at Madam Kang's statement. Madam Kang is the foreign minister of Korea. She made a very well-circulated video statement as early as the late February last year. And she explained what the Korean government was trying to do. And it was an all-of-government approach where every ministry was involved. They reorganized schools. They reorganized public transportation. They reorganized the workplace. The Ministry of Human Resources provided very detailed guidelines on how to reorganize different types of workplaces in order to ensure minimization of contagion. These were the kinds of policies which were adopted in the East Asian countries, including poorer countries like Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia. And we see that they were very, very effective. But because we took a particular kind of approach, we managed to suppress the curve, so to speak, for a little while. And then after that temporary suppression of the curve, we go back to, back to normal, so-called normal. And that was a mistake, because there is no normal, as you pointed out, Dato Seri, in the new situation. So we need to adopt. You need to have an all-of-government approach. You need to have an whole-of-society involvement. Look at the spontaneous support by members of society when it comes to providing aid, welfare aid to the less fortunate people in society. Look at the spontaneous volunteerism of young people to help out with the vaccination campaign. If you do things right, you mobilize all of society wants to lick this problem. But unfortunately, you have a top-down approach which is not been going anywhere. Okay, and often it is misinformed, as we have learned in recent days. So you have a particular approach, and it is for this reason why it is important for us to recognize that you cannot just turn on and off an economy. You just can't turn off and on enterprises. That is disastrous. And especially when you have an open-ended kind of thing where you can just keep on turning it off and on. I mean, we have heard from Tan Sri Yong, and I'm sure we will hear from Mr. Khoo and others about how difficult it is for businesses to adjust to this. And we need to understand that it doesn't make sense. A lot of the measures taken just do not make sense. You don't need a rocket scientist to figure that out. Any person can think thinks through the problem can recognize this. But what we have now is a slowdown which is induced by government policy, and therefore you need to deal with it, recognizing its problems. And you need to have, as usual, when you have a downturn, including a downturn induced by your own policy, you need to have counter-cyclical policies. And this is a very important goal. For older generation like Dato Sri and others, you all know that this was what Keynes' ideas were predicated on. But remember that Roosevelt didn't wait for Keynes to publish his general theory. Roosevelt acted on the New Deal way back in 1933. So you need to recognize, just use common sense to think through a particular problem, and you recognize that you need to have counter-cyclical policies. And that is why I welcome the Prihatin program when it first came out last year, but it was not sustained. You know, people need to live. People need to keep the economy going. Aggregate demand needs, and you can, obviously, given the nature of the economy today, you cannot depend on Keynesian policies to become the employer of last resort, but you can become the buyer of last resort to keep the economy going, and to help people who are unfortunately living in precarious conditions and need to deal with it. Now we have a situation where fiscal policy is a major challenge. If you look at all the rich countries in the West especially, and in Japan, all of them have been undertaking strong counter-cyclical fiscal policies, borrowing as necessary. We in Malaysia hesitate, and quite understandably, because we have a government where you have people, all kinds of people being appointed to all kinds of positions, and you begin to wonder, you know, how policies are being made, and you worry that you know, giving more money to such a government it can be a license for disaster, for increasing corruption and abuse. So people hesitate, understandably, in Malaysia, but we have to recognize that counter-cyclical fiscal policies are what are contributing, besides vaccinations, to improved economic performance in the West. Okay, and this is, I think, very important. So being bold about fiscal policy is essential. We cannot be held hostage to the credit rating agencies and people like that. The next point I'd like to make in this connection is the whole question of trade liberalization. Let's face it, trade liberalization over a decade ago. Whether you like it or not, it ended with the global financial crisis. And if you look, the major economies in the world all responded with restrictive trade measures. And it is important to keep trade going. I completely agree with the sentiment about keeping trade going. But look at the latest free trade agreements. They are not about keeping trade going. Look, if you're talking about exporting Malaysian exports to the rest of the world, who is doing anything about that in the latest free trade agreements? The latest free trade agreements are essentially about strengthening intellectual property rights, strengthening investor-state dispute settlements. This is what the TPP was about, and not surprisingly, many people hesitated. Now, Vietnam, which has particular problems, welcomed the TPP as a way of getting out of those problems. Okay, but now, do you see any great enthusiasm about Vietnam waiting for the CPTPP? Because for them, access to the US was the crucial thing. Without the US, the CPTPP is useless for them. Okay? Because their problems, their bilateral problems, were mainly with the US. So let's look at what the CPTPP brings to us. You know, extending the scope of intellectual property to biologics. What is biologics? It means that, for example, insulin right now, which cannot be subject to private intellectual property, can be subjected to intellectual property because it's a naturally occurring substance. So we should think through this kind of thing and finally hope that somehow or other free trade agreements are going to magically save us from the situation we are in. We have to recognize what is happening right now in the world and how things have changed so fundamentally over the last dozen years. So in looking forward, and frankly, nobody can claim to know what the post-pandemic world is going to be. But looking at the situation right now, I think you're absolutely right, Dato Sri, in reminding us that COVID-19 is endemic. Alberto Burla, the chief executive of Pfizer, has already incorporated it into his medium-term plans. But what does this mean when you leave it to the private sector? When you think about the elimination of smallpox, the elimination of polio, Jonas Salk said, patent the vaccine for polio? That's like trying to patent the sun. It doesn't make sense. This is a vaccine for the people. But when you have a situation where it is left to the private sector, Burla basically takes the view, okay, and he has announced it, he's very blatant about it, that he is opposed to any violation of intellectual property rights. And if you look at what is happening right now, it is the West which is opposing the proposal from South Africa and India to suspend the intellectual property rights, which is not only impeding access to the vaccines, but it's also impeding access to tests. It's also impeding access to personal protective equipment, to treatments, and so on and so forth. So we have to rethink our attitude about a whole range of issues, both international as well as domestic. But unless we have the kind of openness and in terms of public policy and to think about these issues, I mean, what the chambers of commerce have raised as problems have been well known for a year and a half. We could have addressed these issues much earlier, but unfortunately, we have a situation where some people presume that they know best, and this is a very major problem. So if we are going to learn anything from this pandemic, I think we need to really learn and rethink our basic assumptions about the way the economy operates, and rethink what is needed in order for us to move forward. There are a number of other issues, Dato Sri, but I think let me stop here to listen to the other colleagues. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jomo. As expected, I think you would be approaching from a very social justice point of view. And at this juncture, both in terms of health and economy, I think this justification is an important element, and policies will have to be tuned to it. And as earlier Tan Sri Abdul Wahid Omar mentioned, some of the initiatives given by the government and then keeps on adding more and more for the betterment of the society and the people. But the fact remains, how far can you go if the basic problem remains unresolved? And thank you very much for pointing out that policy failures, because of our light-hearted approach at the beginning to the COVID situation, maybe early 2020, and now even in the height of this pandemic, what is our response in terms of basing it on experiences, particularly China and Korea, and even right now what China is doing, and some of these polemics that is coming in on the vaccine and the recognition of the vaccine on the international front. Who will be recognized without quarantine, and who will be stopped from moving, whether for tourism or business, are important questions that seems to be coming up. And thank you very much for that. And then we move on to the next speaker. I think this will be a sort of a corollary that is coming from Dr. Jomo's points of view. Professor Dr. Evelyn Devadason, she will be addressing us, and she is very much trade-related, and therefore she will be focusing on some aspects of how the COVID has impacted the trade patterns, and probably some supply chain and other things which are important in order to continue our efforts and increase our productivity in the so-called post-COVID scenario. Dr. Evelyn?
Thank you, Dato Sri. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Loud and clear.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for having me. I'll share my thoughts on productivity and competitiveness. To begin with, the pandemic is still unfolding, and the issues that persist before the pandemic, such as low value added activities, deficits in skill base, anemic or low quality private investments, and lethargic innovation, they continue. So what can be done, and how would firms probably restructure or be forced to restructure in the case of this pandemic? So I think it's interesting to look at productivity from the firm level, sectoral, and the macro level. From the firm level, it will actually entail how firms will adjust. We see the pandemic has asymmetric effects on small firms vis-a-vis large MNCs. But again, the lockdowns have affected across board all firms. So how will these firms position themselves? I mean, a key to survivability or a push during this pandemic would be digitalization. We have heard a lot of this. It's easy to say, innovate, automate, and digitalize. These are the three key buzzwords. But will firms be able to make this transition seamlessly? That would be based on to what extent these firms have been affected by the pandemic. Digitalization would require cutting-edge technologies, would also require high skills, and this in turn is needed to support our engagement and our continuity in the global value chains. Now, if you look at some recent data, if you look at the Euro database and you track the annual growth rate of Malaysia's backward participation, an interesting revelation is that forward linkages have exceeded marginally backward linkages. Though we are still engaged in backward linkages, we see some strides made in the electronics industry with fabrication technology. But again, it is not broad-based. It is just for a specific segment. So overall, we're still engaged in backward linkages. That is one. But even being engaged in forward linkages, we have to bear in mind that forward linkages, we can also be susceptible to demand side shocks, because what we are doing in forward linkages is that we are producing parts and components to be used in third markets. So that does not mean that if we move towards forward linkages, we are necessarily going to be resilient to any kind of supply side shocks or disruptions in supply chains. So it's interesting to see that we are still very much behind design and development, even within electronics, though we have some strides in fabrication technology. So how will these firms move forward? How will they capitalize and increase within firm productivity? That would be essential. And I think Dato Seri mentioned about workplace arrangements. Now, what we see now is work from home. Interestingly, a lot of us think work from home reduces productivity drastically. Yes and no. For some specific tasks, work from home can be beneficial. There can be still coordination, but overall, the tendency is to think that work from home erodes social coordination, social capital, and coordination. So how will firms adjust as the pandemic unfolds, or even if the pandemic ends, which is unlikely looking at the way things go? How will firms adjust? The likely thing that we'll see firms having a hybrid form of work arrangement. We may see firms keeping some workers who are less productive, or workers that need greater coordination and social capital to come and work on site, and those that are highly productive and tasks that can be actually connected through technology to still work from home. So we could have a kind of a hybrid working arrangement. So that could be some factors that we need to think about when we think about within firm level productivity. Now, in the case of sectoral productivity at a broader scale, we need to look at how this within firm productivity, how the innovation that happens will diffuse across board. Will SMEs be able to innovate? There are a lot of initiatives that have been put in place, but we still see low digital adoption. We still see low technological readiness. In fact, even among the big MNCs, we only see 37% of them using high technology or engaging in high technology in manufacturing. So what is the capacity of these firms to innovate? So that is my first part on labor productivity and firm level productivity. Now, second issue on firm level productivity, a lot of us talk about competitive advantage. Firms actually addressing competitive advantage and being resilient to supply chains. What is this competitive advantage? Producing things that are better, higher quality at low cost. But today it's about investing in sustainable advantage. Okay, sustainable advantage is key, and that's why we see that firms having ESG, environmental, social, and governance credentials, it is really imperative. And why do I say that? A lot of countries are actually tying market access to sustainable development objectives. Whether we sign on to these agreements which are legally binding, such as CPTPP, which has individual environment and labor chapters which are more legally binding than the loose form that we see in RCEP, it really does not matter, because along the supply chains, standards are already being imposed. We see greater demand and expectations from foreign stakeholders for companies to actually disclose sustainability issues in terms of carbon emission. And this comes against a lot of allegations that we already see coming on board regarding labor infringement rights of some of these firms for use of forced labor, child labor. So we cannot escape. I mean, even if we think, companies think that they are on survival mode and they could sideline these issues anyhow because Malaysia has not ratified some of these agreements that are legally binding, they will be forced to commit and comply. So commitment and compliance to sustainable advantages is key to moving forward. It's not about, a lot of times I see it's like data is released on, oh, our trade balances have improved and become healthy. What do trade balances mean? It simply means that in this case, if you track in the last 2 years, imports have contracted faster than exports. We're engaged in backward supply chains. So if there is no demand, imports will definitely contract faster than exports. And you will see a healthy trade balance. But does that mean that we can sustain our export revenues? Does that mean that we can make better inroads into markets that are stringent and strict and that enforce sustainability issues? It's not the case. And what is telling is the recent Sustainability Trade Index that was released, the STI 2020, on average, our score was 52.7%, which is considerably low. And if you look at the pillars that it was low, we were actually low on the environment and social pillars. That is linked to sustainability. And what is interesting is that we were not just behind Singapore, we were behind Thailand and the Philippines. So I think it's important that the S aspect, the social aspect and the environmental aspect be given due diligence by companies. And third, so it's irrespective of whether we actually ratify those agreements, these standards will come through the supply chain. And what people talk about today, sustainable trade is key to maintaining access to markets and capital. Sustainable trade is also important to ensure that we maintain our export revenues. Sustainable trade is therefore key, and companies should move along these lines to integrate with not just the next frontier, with the current frontier of sustainable global value chains. So it's not just about global value chains anymore, it's about sustainable global value chains. The next, from firm productivity, I'd like to move at the macro level. When we talk about productivity, if I may share here, it's all about the ease of doing business. We are engaged in a project called the Asean Seamless Trade Facilitation indicators. And basically what we are looking at is how ASEAN economies have moved in terms of trade facilitation, especially after the WTO trade facilitation agreement has come into force. And when you look at the scores, between 2018 and 2021, we have not fared well. We have made a lot of improvements in terms of customs formalities, export-import formalities, not just exports, imports, but also transit or transshipment trade. We have made some improvements in clearance and release of cargo. But what is very disappointing is that there were no improvements in terms of transport facilitation and e-commerce. Of course, it depends on our methodology and how we go down and what are the specs that we look at. Now, what does this tell you? Logistics and trade is so important for supporting GVCs. In fact, if you can say, digitalization of trade calls for digitalization of trade facilitation mechanisms. So what do businesses look for? We look for electronic documentation, cross-border paperless trading for e-commerce, for example. So today, trade is not in the traditional way of thinking about transport costs. It's all about transaction costs, which involves enforcement costs, enforcement contract costs, information costs. Yes, I cannot forget that information costs, which is very important. And in this context, I'd like to talk a bit about data. It's very interesting to talk about GVCs, yeah, global value chains, and how they have changed before the crisis, even during the China-US, when the China-US trade war began, people started to talk about the shortening of the supply chains. Today, people talk about the restructuring of those global value chains. The way we think of GVCs, it's no more a unilateral transaction beginning with product and research design right up to parts and components, procurement, logistics, distribution. Today, we think of the production supply chain. So when we think of it as a linear transaction, we think of the information flow as linear throughout the supply chain. Now, if you look at Rayti's recent seminar, if I may quote them, it was very interesting about how they brought about how this production chain has evolved. It is omnidirectional. At the heart of this whole supply chain is data, which sits at the center. So data connectivity, when we talk about logistics, this is very important. So while we think of logistics technology as reshaping GVCs, let's say we think of the Internet of Things, blockchain technologies, which are allowing for speedier clearance of cargo, timeliness and delivery and secureness of the supply chains. We also need to think how this restructured GVCs with this omnidirectional flow of data is demanding new technologies in turn. So it's a bilateral causality between the technology demand and the way in which GVCs are being restructured. And this is interesting when we talk about data and data connectivity. We come to e-commerce, where Malaysia has not fared well. I mean, an uptick of this pandemic is the rise of e-commerce. And a lot of people think like, oh, pandemic has brought about some good things that we can continue with. But what is the supporting infrastructure for e-commerce? We have not moved ahead. In fact, recently we had a discussion on ASEAN interoperability. So when we talk about ASEAN interoperability, interfacing the government agencies' systems, okay, with the national single window and then the national single window with the ASEAN single window. It was amazing to see how fast Indonesia has moved relative to Malaysia. Singapore is always at the forefront. We have interfaced. Yes, our NSW is operational, fully operational. We were at the forefront. We have interfaced the government agencies, but does it stop there with the port authorities? Singapore has gone ahead with the trade financiers. So how is our ecosystem evolving? To what extent are we taking care of user protection policy and data flows, security of data flows? So there's still a lot of work on trade facilitation reforms at the policy level. As an academician, I would also like to point out in terms of data, just not transparency and data flows. Tan Sri made a comment about targeted incentives. How do we make targeted incentives? All we see is broad-based incentives. And sometimes as an academician, I wonder, we think of, okay, we have to invest in intangibles. That's the way to go. Bring back the investment-driven model. We have to invest in higher value added activities. But how do we actually do that? I mean, what is the specifics in those policies? Now, understanding the specifics means integrating GVC analysis into policy work. Malaysia lacks micro-financial data to look into these kind of issues. And if you see the kind of policies that come up from the US and Europe, their level of data at the micro firm level data is so strong that they're able to identify. And why do I bring this point out? A very telling story which was mentioned earlier is when we think of essentials, even our understanding of domestic supply chains is so low in the sense that we open some industries without thinking of their linkages with the other industries which are considered non-essential. So it's counterproductive to opening up some industries and closing the rest, because through the supply chains, those industries are still crippled and they cannot move forward. So GVC analysis into policy work is so important, knowing where are the blocks in the GVCs, how do we upgrade, what incentives are needed to upgrade, where those incentives are needed. So this is lacking, and I think it's very important because today 60 to 70% of global trade is all through value chains. So
Thank you. Thank you.
with a very quick takeaway. So my takeaway would be restructuring of firms, investments in tangibles are important, how they address new hybrids of working arrangement, and then at the sectoral level and also at the firm level, if you would like to call it, maintaining export intensity. As Prof. Jomo said, we still need to be open, even though we see restrictive policies, we still have, but more importantly, we cannot shy away from sustainable trade. And finally, the ecosystem needs to be there. The trade facilitation mechanisms to improve the ease of doing business needs to be there to help the firms become more competitive. With that, thank you.
Very good point to sum it up. You know, the micro level, I think the firms will have to be given the basic necessities in order to survive even during the pandemic or even the post-pandemic. Now we have come to the final. Andrew, I think you're not last but the least of something like that. Andrew Khoo is a young man with a lot of expertise spanning from Europe to Singapore and Malaysia. He is Chairman and Chief Executive Officer, Malayan United Industries. So over to you, Andrew, for your final, and I suppose you would look at it from an industry perspective and probably how the global scenario is working out for your own business and for Malaysians who are globalizing their businesses. Over to you, Andrew.
Okay, thank you, Dato Sri. Distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning. A lot of time has been spent talking about this COVID-19 pandemic. So let me just share with you what I discussed with my senior leadership team just last week. And at that meeting, I said to them, we have lost. Humankind has lost the battle against COVID-19. So let that sink in for a moment. I think it is indeed true that COVID-19, the pandemic, has become an endemic. There's no way to beat this. So it's a question of how do we live with this? And I think this is very important because it's how we reframe the discussion and where do we go from here? How do we come up with positive action plans and policies to be able to cope and live with this going forwards? There is this famous quote, which is quite apt. In the midst of every crisis lies great opportunity. But perhaps not many of you know it is from Albert Einstein. Well, Malaysia is facing a crisis like nothing we've ever seen before. It's not just a crisis of our generation, but it is a crisis of our lifetime. The famous Winston Churchill also famously said, never let a good crisis go to waste. So I put it to all of you that it is very important that the government and the people must seize the opportunity that is in front of us. It's been widely reported that the country's fiscal deficit has doubled to about 86 billion, or around 6% of our annual economic output. And this is expected to widen to 6 to 7% this year. And of course, there has also been an increase in the federal government debt to 67% of GDP. But yesterday it has been reported that Malaysia will lower its economic growth outlook for this year, as the GDP growth outlook will be likely closer to 4% from the current number of 6%. So the strength and timing of recovery will depend largely on the efficacy of the mass vaccination program and a broad-based rebound in consumption, investment, and exports. But the reality of the situation is that the successive lockdowns is costing the economy 1 billion a day. And compounding this problem is that only 11% of the population is fully vaccinated. So, reference back to what I said earlier, we need to learn how to live with this pandemic, right? Which is now an endemic. So I think the key, of course, we all know this, is this fast and speedy rollout of the vaccination program so that we can open the economy again. So coupled with all these problems that we're currently facing, of course, we know is the ongoing political uncertainty. So Malaysia is indeed at a crossroads. So will the government take advantage of these times to implement major structural changes to enhance the long-term competitiveness of the country? Or will the country continue to be mired in inefficient planning and a misallocation of resources? Well, against this backdrop, I would still like to hold an optimistic view of the future. The country will eventually recover, but the question is when. And even with the expected rebound, we still need to be realistic. It will take time for Malaysia's economic output to return to its pre-pandemic levels. So how do we ensure we do not let a good crisis go to waste? Well, I believe one of the things Malaysia must do is to make itself more attractive to new investors, particularly in emerging sectors like technology. I do think that the Malaysian Investment Development Authority is on the right track by looking into attracting investments in new and high-tech areas post-COVID-19. The key is to be supported by well-developed infrastructure and numerous incentives for potential investors. So I think NIDA is focusing on dislocation opportunities. For example, companies from countries that are affected by the trade war, and to hopefully shift their operations to Malaysia and to utilize Malaysia as a hub to penetrate the Southeast Asian market. But ultimately, leadership remains the key. I think leaders are essential to chart a different course, a road less traveled, and even make unpopular decisions as needed. So such leaders need courage and humility to meet the challenges and to rise to the occasion. So let's hope and pray our leaders, both in the public and private sector, are up to the task, and that out of this great crisis will arise the next generation of great leaders. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you for your personal views. Of course, businessmen like you continue to face challenges, and you have to take on the responsibility, as many of them are doing. It is very good that you are giving us the optimistic view. The question, as I said at the opening of this panel discussion, is when. Nobody is very sure about it, but we have some experiences to go by from neighboring countries or from faraway countries, and also from US and so on with regard to this. I think we have come to the end, we have, although we started a little bit early, we had about 8 minutes of time ahead of us, and we will be completing this at 11:15. So we have about 10 minutes to look at some of the questions that has been fed to us. If it is directly related to your comment, then I would ask you to make a reply. If it is a general comment, we'll just take note of it. So the first question it's coming is Muhammad Adib Ismail. He is saying strict MCO does not save life. That is his personal view, I suppose. I'm not sure any of the panelists here is actually, I wouldn't say competent or not, is a health expert or an immunology or a virologist or any of these. But based on what is happening in the country, I think there is a lot of experiment being done on the MCO. As the numbers increase, you have to go for lockdown to prevent the number of infections. And related to that is the hospitalization and hospitalization into ICU, and ultimately a number will die. But if you look at the NST this morning, the front page, you'll find that there is a huge crowd in the Melawati Stadium Center where the infection is being tested. I think this is also unprecedented and shows a sort of a panic situation which we want to overcome. If panic strikes our country and people are getting into a fear syndrome, I think this is going to be very bad. I would just like to echo the fact earlier said, the government is doing whatever it is best that it thinks it is doing. It is learning from the experiences, as Dr. Jomo mentioned about past experiences in other countries, particularly China and so on. The next question that comes from a person who did not name himself or herself is the worker accommodation. Can I ask Tan Sri Yong, I think you have been in the Federation of Malaysian Manufacturers and so on, foreign workers coming in and workers accommodation, whether they are Malaysians or, and whether this has in some ways contributed to the clusters which the government is now tackling in a big way. If you have any comments on this.
Well, there is no doubt that the workers' accommodation problem has contributed. In fact, even Singapore, they had a very good record in the first few months, and then they had a second wave, largely due to the migrant workers' dormitories. And they spent actually a lot of effort to go around for virtually testing everyone in those dormitories. And I think some form of concerted effort has been done here. And I've also heard a lot about the companies who want to in case they cannot build in time, to actually convert many of the unsold properties. We have quite a large overhang of properties in the country, and there are a lot of movement to say, how can we expedite either the planning permission to convert some of these buildings into dormitories that they could be recited. So these are the steps that's going on. And of course, testing, there are different costs of testing. Some are going like 60 ringgit to 80 ringgit, and some are 15 ringgit. And some sort of a standardized form of recognized tests should be done so that at least every week, these can be tested. We have also heard that the actual number of cases coming from the manufacturing sector is relatively small. It's not 80%. I think it's of the order of 10% or 12%. And it is not so much at the workplace that it is transmitted. It is actually when they go back either to the dormitories or in somebody's public housing that has happened. So even the public housing that this testing has to be done. So it's a question of a targeted testing, and then thereafter proceeding to have this rollout of vaccines. And the moment that you have vaccinated workers in the factory, that at least this opening is a bit more relaxed. That is how I would see it.
Thank you, Tan Sri. Another question that is coming is Mr. Pek Boon Soon. He is relating to what you have just answered. He said, why the country has not gone into mass testing of asymptomatic to stop the spread of the virus? Again, this is a very, very technical kind of question. I do not know whether anybody would like to make a comment.
Can come in, if I can come in, Dato Sri, that's a...
Yes, Dr. Jomo.
Yes, thank you. It's not a very technical issue. It's a question of whether you put in the resources to do mass testing or you don't. And mass testing is actually much cheaper if you use the rapid testing kits, which also give you results very, very quickly. The problem, of course, is that rapid testing kits have a lower level of accuracy. And that's why there has been a very heavy emphasis, especially in Malaysia, on the much more expensive and slower PCR tests. But you know, what is needed is just because I was not infected yesterday doesn't mean I cannot be infected today. What you need is the RTKs as to, you know, to do that kind of mass testing. So even though you're not getting 99%, you're getting 95% accuracy. It is a very important and useful method, and this is something which has been done very well in other East Asian countries, including countries like Vietnam and so on and so forth. It's a question of of policy choices. It's not a question of it being technically very, very difficult to understand.
Thank you, Dr. Jomo. I think,
and added to that, it's just mass testing, but it must be combined much better with the My Sejahtera ad. So that the moment there's any connection, somebody is positive, it immediately gets reflected to the rest of the community in which he is involved in.
yes, I think testing and infection and positive hospitalization, ICU, I think these are issues very critical, and we are trying to reduce those numbers as much as possible. And they are talking about, I think the minister yesterday announced about this herd immunity. The herd immunity is not going to be in the environment, in the social environment, until you have vaccinated up to about 70 to 80%. We have not gone into that one, and probably we have to wait until September, October, when our vaccination program comes into fruition. Although, sorry.
Can I just
yes,
chip
please,
in a bit? See, this is my personal reading into this. You know, when you look at numbers, like, I mean, for example, like cases in Malaysia, when you see there is suddenly one spike, almost 50% of a case seems to be happening in one state alone. To me, that itself put a question mark. Is it really that is the right numbers? You know, we heard of views coming from the Ministry of Health that the numbers are increased because of the ramping up of testing. Does it mean that if we ramp up testing in other states, the case also will rise? So meaning that bottom line is basically at the end of it, we need to be very clear about what that needs to be done now. You know, everyone would agree with me that the promising hope that we have is vaccination. I think pretty much that's the only best hope. Even there, I still say it's hope. It's not a solution to everything, but the best hope is there. To me, that, you know, I mean, we got to be very careful looking at all these numbers. Yes, we can go out and keep on doing testing, and finally we might see that numbers will increase everywhere. I mean, if truly Selangor case is because of ramping up of testing. So see, let me just share you one simple basic case. 80+%, 70 to 80% of cases now is sporadic in nature, meaning that these are cases that cannot be associated to any cluster. So, but the nation is discussing cluster. The nation is discussing only about 20 or maybe less, 15% of the cases. Clusters is actually very small if you look at the numbers. I mean, so where are we heading? I mean, are we attending where the problems are, or are we attending situation under the bright light where everybody is looking at it? You know, retail sector, education sectors, and so on is almost nil if you look at the percentage of the total cases. So I like to urge everybody to be a bit more refined in terms of looking at the data, and so that the conclusion is right. Even when we say factories, everybody is easy to blame factories, but look at the data carefully. I mean, many are looking at a wrong data and arguing that factories are the problems, but those are percentage to the clusters, not to the total cases. So someone need to rectify this. I hope that you know, either Ministry of Health or anyone will come out and explain these numbers correctly. You know, because we do not want to do something which is driven by a wrong interpretation of numbers. And I would seriously believe that, you know, again, science and data are important here, so that we address where the problems are, and the nature that we address also have to evolve over time. All this issue of essentials, all this issue of cluster, all this issue of lockdown is last year. It shouldn't be now. I mean, now if you want to do that, I think you will make the entire nation to collapse because of COVID and because of the economy as well. So I think we need to, I agree with Prof. Jomo, review, relook at it, and I agree with Andrew at the same time, do not let this crisis to waste. If we do recovery without reform, it's a waste. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Tasri Noor Azlan. That, I think, must bring us close to this first panel session. It has been a wonderful session, at least for me, from the views of the industry players as well as academicians, and from the government policy perspectives and so on. And for those who have raised questions, I'm afraid there are many more questions that now on the pipeline. I will not be able to give opportunity as we have to close this. So once again, thank you very much, Tan Sri Michael, and the Secretariat headed by Caroline and Kamalaveni, and of course, moderator Zaim, for your contributions to organize this well. And the panelists, I'm very, very impressed with your contributions, and I hope you will continue to assist us in KSI and ECL in our future ventures. I just want to pray to everybody free from COVID, and I hope all of you have been vaccinated at least with 1 dose. If you are 2 doses, you're far away from COVID infection. If it infects you, you will have extremely valid immunity and good health. Wish you all that. Thank you very much.